Welcome back, physicists. We are going to take some data that we collected doing a Noodle Lab, and we are going to turn it into a graph. So here you can see a completed data table where I took the independent variable, so the number of noodles, and I collected 8 different data points using 2 and sometimes 3 trials and averaging that data. And I saw how many pennies a noodle bridge was able to hold before it broke. So in our last video, you saw that we set up 2 different trials, but on this data table, you might notice that 2 of these data points have 3 trials. And have a look at this average column. As we go down our data table, we can see that as the number of noodles increases, so too does the number of pennies that is able to be supported. Except for data points 6 and 7. We saw an increase between 5 and 6, but then a decrease between 6 and 7 before we saw an increase again between 7 and 8. So once I noticed that I had this irregularity in my data with trial 1 and trial 2, I added a third trial for those 2 data points just to make sure that that really was the trend that I was supposed to see. So whenever you have an irregularity in data, so anytime that you have iffy data, you could and should run another trial to make sure that your data truly represents what you are supposed to see. So if you have iffy data, run more trials. And you can see that the trial 3 supported what I expected. And so did trial 2. Trial 1, in both cases, something must have gone awry. Maybe I miscounted my pennies, maybe I threw down the pennies too hard, something went strange. So we're going to take that average and we're going to see how the average of the 3 trials fits in with the rest of that data, how ugly it makes our graph. And if it makes our data unusable, we can eliminate trial 1 because those might be outliers. Because outliers don't follow the trend. All right, so in this case, we are going to use Microsoft Excel in order to graph our data. But first, let's come up with a plan. Whenever you graph data, there are some rules of thumb that you need to follow. Just like any graph, we're going to have an X and a Y axis. And we need to determine which variable is going to go on the X-axis and which variable is going to go on the Y-axis. There is a cutesy way of remembering, and that is that if we draw a giant I for independent variable, notice that it lines up with the X-axis. So in general, we are going to put our independent variable on the X-axis. And if we are to draw a giant D for the dependent variable, notice that the letter D lines up with the y-axis, so in general, we are going to put the dependent variable on the y-axis. other rules of graph drawing is that we have to put axis labels on our graphs. So we determined that the independent variable is going to go on the x-axis. So we're going to label that with our independent variable, the number of noodles. Notice that I did not just write independent variable, I am actually writing what I measured in this lab. Otherwise, this graph would be useless to an outside observer. And I'm going to indicate in parentheses the unit that I use to measure how many noodles there are. So that way my person that reads this graph, my reader, knows that I'm not counting noodles by the box or the dozen. I'm just counting by the individual noodle. And on the y-axis is my maximum number of pennies, my dependent variable. And again, I need to put a parentheses with the unit so that my reader knows that I am measuring by the individual penny and not by the roll of pennies, or again, the dozen of pennies. And we are going to make a scatter plot of the averages. So a scatter plot is the one where you have dots for each independent data point. And each of those data points is going to be the average. I am not plotting my 3 trials. I am only plotting my averages. And what that should do is that should give us an overall trend that we can see. So I already know, just looking at my data, that as the number of pennies goes up, so too does my number of noodles. So I would expect my dots to go upwards like this. But the last thing I'm going to need before I actually plot this in Excel is I'm going to need a title. Now in science class, the most generic way that you can title something is by literally naming it the title of 2 axes. So we can title it blank versus blank, where we are going to kind of read left to right here. We're going to write down the name of the y-axis versus the name of the x-axis. So my title is going to be the maximum number of pennies versus the number of noodles, which is the title of the x-axis. Now let's put this to practice in Excel. We are going to want to use the desktop app version of Excel. It has a little more functionalities than the one that is online. And once we open up Excel, we're going to click this first box here that says blank. And notice that there's a whole bunch of boxes. And it kind of looks like a battleship board where we have each column marked with letters and each row marked with numbers. And these boxes that meet up at the intersection are named cells, Excel. Now, you can, once you click on a box, you can type in numbers or you can type in letters. And all that we're going to do is we are going to take our independent variable and make a column, maybe in column A, and our average and make a column, maybe column B. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and type out number of noodles, parentheses, measured in noodles. And it goes beyond column A. There's a few ways I can fix this. The first thing I'm going to fix is I'm going to make my column wider. So if you hover your mouse between columns A and B, you might notice that the mouse becomes a vertical line with 2 arrows kind of pushing outwards. That lets you resize the column. So I could make it enormous and make it wide enough for that entire phrase, or I could go to this fancy little thing known as wrap text. So at the very top ribbon in the home menu, under the alignment section, there should be a button that looks like, ABC with the arrow, and if you hover over it, it should say wrap text. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that box that's too big or too many words and click on wrap text. And notice it just kind of wraps it down into the rest of the cell here. So if your screen isn't full screen, you have to click alignment and then you can click on wrap text. Okay. My second column is going to be my, maximum number of pennies, and that's going to be measured in pennies, and that extends beyond the box too, so I'm going to make my column a little wider by clicking between the columns, and I'm going to also go back up to the home alignment wrap text. At this point, I'm just going to enter in my data, and I can navigate to different cells using the arrow keys, or you could click on the cells individually. It is up to you. At this point, it's just typing in this data. Oops. Great. So now that I have my data, I am going to tell Excel that I want to make a graph out of it. So I'm going to click somewhere, anywhere really, on this spreadsheet, so anywhere in this window here. And at the very top, I'm going to click Insert. And then I can see that there's a section called Charts. I am going to pick the chart that looks like a whole bunch of dots, and when I hover over it, it says Insert Scatter. That's the kind of chart that I want. That's the kind of graph I want. So I'm going to click on that button, and then I'm going to choose the very first option here that just says Scatter. I don't want any of these connect the dots kind of hoopla. I just want a scatter chart. I click it, and it is blank. But honestly, that's what I want. Notice that when I click on this blank box that just popped up, I have new options at the top. No options, yes options. Chart design and format. Under this chart design, I'm going to tell Excel what data I want in my chart. So I'm going to go to Select Data, and I want to add some data. I am going to name this data. I'm going to say noodles and pennies. Doesn't really matter what you name it. My X values, let's see, what did I want on my X-axis? I wanted the number of noodles on my X-axis. So in the block that says X values, I am going to highlight the numbers. I'm not going to highlight the top, the title, the label. I'm just going to highlight the numbers. And that's all I'm going to do. Notice that it outlines the numbers that I want. Then I'm going to delete whatever is there in the Y values, and I'm going to highlight the numbers I want on my Y-axis. Click and drag. I'm going to press OK. I'll press OK again, and you can see that I have a fairly decent line. There's my weirdo outlier at data point 7. It looks like data point 5 is kind of off the trend as well. That's all right. The other thing that I need is a title and axis labels. So let's go up. Again, we're going to stay selected on this data table, or sorry, chart. And we're going to go up to Chart Design, Add Chart Element. And I am going to add axis titles, the horizontal and the vertical. Right now, it's just a generic axis title, but if I click, it becomes a text box, which I can change to be my y-axis, which was the maximum number of pennies, measured in pennies. and my x-axis, which was the number of noodles measured by the noodle. And it automatically gave me a title, which was the same as my series name. I'm just gonna go ahead and change that to be y versus x. So maximum number of pennies versus number of noodles. And I can resize it if I wanted to by clicking on these little sides here. Oops, maybe I can't. Old jerk. Whatever. Good enough. Perfect. All right, we are almost done. The last thing we have to do is the reason why I wanted you guys to be on the desktop app instead of the online, and that is we are going to add a trend line. So that is very different than connecting the dots. What a trend line is, it's a line of best fit. So in math class, what we would do is we would take a ruler and just kind of eyeball where this line can go through the most data points. And that would show us the general trend of this data. In which case, as the number of noodles increases, so too does the maximum number of pennies. And in math class, you learned how to write a linear equation for that trend line. But we're going to use Excel to do that for us. So let's click on one of the data points. It doesn't matter which one. And notice that they're all selected. They all have little dots around them. I'm going to right-click on one of those data points. And notice that there is an option on this menu that says Add Trend Line. Once I click that, a pop-up menu appears on the side, and it shows me that this data is fairly linear. It makes a line. If I scroll down on this tab that opened to the side, I can show the equation and an r-squared value. So this equation is what I want, and the r-squared value is kind of bonus information. This r-squared value shows me how good my data is. The closer to 1 that I am, the better my data. So 0.97, that's not bad data. Our data fits pretty well to that line. If we had a whole bunch of outliers, like way over here and way over there and way down here, our r-squared value would definitely be worse. Maybe like 0.7 instead of 0.9. And there you have it. You have your graph. In the next video, we will see how to analyze this graph.